White House was silent. Outside, journalists clustered beneath a heavy gray sky. Inside, air conditioning hummed softly, muffling the breathless tension that gripped every hallway. The clock ticked, 4:17 a.m. In the Oval Office, President Donald J. Trump held the presidential phone in one hand and a golden pen in the other. On the wall, Abraham Lincoln's portrait seemed to watch him. An aide whispered that everything was ready. All it took was his word. A simple yes, and the United States would launch a strike against Iran in minutes. The target, Fordow, a heavily fortified underground nuclear facility deep within Iran's mountains. The reason? A chain of provocations, drones, threats, and a final spark, an Israeli strike on Iranian territory, triggering alarm sirens across Tehran. Trump had vowed strength, and now he stood at the brink of turning that vow into war. But elsewhere in the White House, something unexpected was unfolding. A senior general, a man with gray temples and a quiet gaze, walked slowly toward a forgotten safe hidden behind a bookshelf. The safe had been there since Eisenhower's era, sealed away, lost in time, dust gathering along its corners. The general typed a code, turned the handle. A heavy click echoed in the room. Inside were classified folders, sealed reports. But there was also a photograph. He lifted it gently. The image was faded, browned at the edges. It showed American and Iranian soldiers standing side by side, smiling. Tehran, 1977. Before the revolution, before the hostages, before the long years of silence and suspicion. The general didn't move. One of the men in the photo, barely 20, was his father. Back in the Oval Office, the Secretary of Defense's voice rang through the speakerphone. "Mr. President, we are on the clock." But the general was already on his way, photo in hand, mind racing through history. He didn't know exactly what he would say, but he knew that this could not be ignored. Trump looked up as he entered. "Sir," the general said quietly, "there's something you need to see." And for a moment, everything stopped. The plan, the war, time itself, frozen by a piece of aged paper. The general placed the photograph on the resolute desk. The silence that followed was thick and full of meaning. Trump leaned forward. He squinted at the image, unsure at first of what he was looking at. The sepia tones, the smiling faces, the dusty landscape behind them. It looked like something from a war museum. "That's Tehran," the general said, "before 1979, before the revolution." Trump looked at him, puzzled. "That's my father on the left," the general continued. "And on the right, an Iranian officer, his friend. They trained together, they fought together. They believed the future would be built by allies, not enemies." Trump remained silent, fingers still touching the pen. The moment felt suspended in time. Just hours earlier, Israeli jets had bombed the outskirts of Tehran, striking what they claimed was a secret Iranian weapons facility. In response, Iran had scrambled its air defenses, fired warning shots, and shut down major roads across its capital. Sirens blared, families took shelter in basements, and the world held its breath. Trump, under immense pressure from hardliners and foreign allies, had called an emergency national security meeting. Intelligence reports warned that Iran was close to retaliating. The Pentagon had drawn up scenarios. One involved a strike on Fordow, deep, precise, but deadly. Inside the Situation Room, General Michael Kurilla and General Dan Kane had laid out the options. Precise coordinates, casualty estimates, risk of escalation. Trump, staring at the maps, had nodded slowly. "Within 2 weeks," he said, "be ready." But now, here in the Oval Office, that plan hung in the air like smoke. The general's voice was calm, but each word hit like a drumbeat. "My father kept this photo until the day he died," he said. "He told me, never forget the difference between a government and a people." Trump looked down at the faces again. Men in uniform, laughing, relaxed, not knowing what history would soon do to their nations. He didn't speak. The general pointed to the photo. "These aren't enemies, Mr. President. They're a memory, a warning." Outside, the wind picked up, brushing the American flag. Inside, a decision loomed larger than any missile. And the old photograph, silent, fragile, waited for someone to remember what it meant. The red phone blinked softly on the desk, a signal from the war room, confirmation pending. One word from the president, and the chain of command would activate. Fighter jets would launch, submarines would shift into position, satellites would align. And Fordo, the heart of Iran's nuclear ambitions, would be reduced to rubble. Trump stared at the blinking light. The general remained still, his hands folded behind his back. In the room you could almost hear the ticking of the antique clock mounted above the fireplace. The silence wasn't absence. It was pressure. "I don't want a war," Trump said finally, his voice low. The general nodded. But sometimes it takes more courage to step back from the edge than to charge into battle. Trump looked at the photo again. In the picture, the Iranian officer had a small American flag pinned to his chest, a symbol of cooperation during a brief but powerful military alliance in the 1970s. Before the hostage crisis, before the embargoes, before decades of distrust rewrote everything. "They were our partners," the general said. "We trained their forces, shared intelligence. For a moment in history, we dreamed together." Trump stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the south lawn, empty and dark. "We can't let them get nukes," he said. "No, sir, but we can't become what we fear either." The door opened. A security advisor stepped in, tablet in hand. "Mr. President," he said carefully, "we need your final decision. Aircraft are in position." Trump turned back to the desk. The pen still lay beside the phone. The weight of the photo had shifted everything. What had been a moment of action was now a moment of choice. A choice between fear and memory, between fire and restraint. He glanced again at the smiling faces in the photograph, not knowing their fate, not knowing their legacy would survive long enough to stop a war. He exhaled, and for the first time in hours, he sat down slowly. Not to sign, but to think. Across the White House, the Situation Room buzzed with quiet urgency. Screens flickered with live satellite feeds. Middle Eastern maps were zoomed and color-coded. Military advisors stood by in hushed clusters. A red digital clock on the wall counted down the final minutes of the window for the strike. In one corner, General Michael Kurilla checked his watch. His expression was rigid, but his thoughts drifted to the risks. They had wargamed this scenario a dozen times. All paths led to escalation. Iran wouldn't just absorb the hit, it would retaliate against Israel, against U.S. bases, maybe even against civilian targets in the region. Still, orders were orders, unless they changed. Next to him, General Dan Kane scrolled through the final strike packet, the list of assets involved, the projected Iranian casualties, the radiation risk if any part of the facility cracked open. It was, on paper, a clean operation. But no operation is truly clean when history bleeds beneath every line. Tulsi Gabbard, a former congresswoman and military veteran who had been brought in as an intelligence liaison, stood by the back wall, arms crossed. She had spoken earlier during the briefing, a rare voice of dissent in a room otherwise aligned toward force. "They won't forget who struck first," she had said, "and they won't care what excuse we gave." Now she watched the minutes tick down. Then, a change. The main screen flashed. A message from the Oval Office. "Hold. Await further instruction." Kurilla looked up sharply. "He's hesitating." Kane rubbed his chin. "Or reconsidering." Gabbard's face didn't move, but her eyes did. In that pause, in that interruption of momentum, something had shifted. The mechanical machinery of war, briefings, simulations, countdowns, had hit a human wall. A memory, a photo. And in the war room, where hearts are supposed to be replaced by data, silence fell. The red clock kept ticking. But now, its sound seemed uncertain. Back in the Oval Office, Trump held the photograph again. He wasn't a sentimental man, not by nature. But there was something about the picture, about the easy trust on those soldiers' faces, that lingered like a ghost in the room. "You think we're repeating something?" he asked. The general didn't answer right away. He looked at the walls of the room, the portraits, the polished furniture, the quiet weight of decisions that had been made here for more than 2 centuries. "We're always repeating," he said softly. Just depends which part of history we're copying. Trump walked slowly to a side table and poured himself a glass of Diet Coke. The fizz was sharp in the silence. He thought about the headlines he could create, the power, the message to the world. But he also thought about images, of children hiding in bunkers, of cities burning, of coffins returning under American flags, of a father's photo surviving 4 decades in a forgotten safe. Then he remembered something. "You know," he said, turning back to the general, "my grandfather kept a photo too, of Ellis Island. He said it reminded him why he came here, why he left Germany. He looked at it every Sunday." The general nodded. They were both sons of immigrants, both heirs to stories that only made sense if you remembered where they started and what they nearly became. Trump sat again. His fingers hovered over the phone, not to dial, not this time, but to stop. He pressed a button and called in his chief of staff. "Tell the war room to stand down," he said. "We're not doing this tonight." The chief looked startled, but nodded. "Should I prepare a statement for the press?" Trump hesitated, then shook his head. "No, not yet." The general picked up the photo one last time and placed it gently beside the pen. Sometimes the loudest decision is the one no one hears. The order rippled through the command chain like a quiet earthquake. In the Situation Room, screens dimmed slightly as alerts were cleared. The countdown clock was reset. Advisors stepped back from their terminals. The tension that had gripped every neck and shoulder slowly, awkwardly began to ease. No jets took off. No missiles launched. No alarms screamed through the skies of Tehran. For a moment the world held its breath, and then began to exhale. General Kurilla leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the blank screen. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Every officer in the room understood that they had stood on the very edge of fire, and that something fragile had pulled them back. In Tehran, the city never slept that night. Roads remained blocked. Families stayed awake, but no bombs fell. No fire lit the sky. Somewhere, a mother held her son a little tighter, wondering what might have been. In Israel, military analysts adjusted their expectations. Diplomats whispered about missed opportunities. But behind the scenes, there was relief. Because even allies know, a wider war always devours more than it promises. At the Pentagon, some criticized the delay. Others called it restraint. But no one called it weakness, not after hearing the back-channel reports about what had almost happened. In the White House, the general returned to his office. He placed the photo in a simple black frame and set it on his desk. A memory reclaimed, a warning preserved. Trump didn't speak of the moment publicly. No tweet, no announcement, no press conference. Just a decision made, then buried beneath the next headline. But the general knew. He knew that sometimes history hinges not on thunder, but on silence. On a photograph in a dusty safe. On a man who remembers what his father taught him. On a president who, for just a moment, listened. And on the war. That never happened. Days passed, then weeks. The news cycle moved on. Other stories took center stage. Politics, scandals, protests. But beneath the surface, in the quiet corridors of power, the decision still echoed. The intelligence community noticed shifts. Iranian communications suggested confusion. They had expected retaliation. They had prepared for it, but it never came. In Tehran, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei released a cryptic statement about miscalculations of the West, but made no move to escalate. In his inner circle, some viewed the absence of a U.S. response as a sign of strategic hesitation. Others more cautiously saw it as an invitation, a rare moment of pause that could be seized. Back in Washington, Tulsi Gabbard walked alone across the National Mall one evening, thinking about the moment the order had been paused. The image of that red clock stayed with her. How close they had come. How quickly the world could have changed. She wasn't naive. She'd served in war. She knew the weight of violence, but she also knew the cost of pretending that every enemy is permanent. Inside the Pentagon, an unspoken shift occurred. Briefings were more cautious, conversations more reflective. The generals had seen something in the president's face that night. Not fear, but a flicker of memory. A moment of personal history interfering with national machinery. And the general, the one who had found the photo, began speaking to younger officers differently. He told them about his father, about the Iranian soldier who used to write postcards, about how understanding an enemy doesn't mean agreeing with them, but it might mean saving lives. He didn't frame it as a lesson, just a story, because stories survive longer than reports, and that photo, it stayed on his desk, a reminder that in war, the hardest victories are often the ones that leave nothing destroyed, only silence, and the fragile promise that we might, just once, choose to remember instead of repeat. Not all victories are paraded down streets. Some happen behind closed doors, with no flags, no speeches, no applause. This was one of them. There were no headlines announcing that the world had been pulled back from the brink. No awards given to the man who opened an old safe. No television specials dedicated to the photo that changed a president's mind. And yet, thousands, maybe millions, went on living because of it. A child in Baghdad played soccer under an open sky, unaware of how narrowly that sky had avoided fire. A doctor in Tel Aviv finished his night shift without having to rush to an emergency room crowded with casualties. A mother in Tehran baked bread at dawn, never knowing that her home had once been a red dot on a satellite map. The general didn't speak of it again. Not to the press, not even to his family. But every now and then, late at night, he'd glance at the photo on his desk. His father's face, young and full of belief, and next to him, the Iranian soldier, whose name he never learned, but whose friendship had stopped a war decades later. One image, two men, one memory strong enough to delay destruction. Trump never mentioned the incident in his memoirs. Perhaps it didn't fit the narrative. Perhaps he forgot. Or perhaps in his own way, he understood that some choices speak louder when left unspoken. But for those who knew, the generals, the advisors, the ones who had watched the countdown pause, it remained etched into their memories. History isn't just made by the loudest voices. Sometimes it's shaped by silence, by hesitation, by a whisper between two men standing in a room that holds the weight of the world. And in that whisper, the future shifted. Not with fire, but with a photo. There was something about the way the photo lay next to the pen that lingered in the general's memory. One represented destruction, the other remembrance. The pen, the same one used to sign executive orders, military authorizations, sweeping decisions that altered the fates of nations. A symbol of power, heavy in the hand, a tool that could ignite or extinguish. The photo, light, fragile, aged by decades of air and dust. A symbol of a past easily forgotten. But in that moment, it had carried more weight than any signature ever could. The contrast was stark, and yet somehow it made perfect sense. In the following months, the story leaked in fragments, whispers from unnamed sources, quiet mentions in deep background articles. But without official confirmation, it faded like fog at sunrise. Still, within the Pentagon, within intelligence circles, the incident was remembered. It became a cautionary tale. Not about cowardice, but about courage of a different kind. Because pulling a trigger is easy. Slowing down the machine when everything is already in motion, that's harder. And for the general, the decision wasn't just about policy. It was about legacy. His father had served at a time when Iran and America believed in something shared: cooperation, training, partnership. That time had collapsed under the weight of revolution and retaliation, but it had existed. And maybe, just maybe, it could exist again. One night, months later, the general gave a speech to a room full of young officers. He spoke of command, of judgment, of the burden of power. Then he paused. He didn't tell them the whole story, but he held up the photo. "This," he said, "is why we remember. Not because it's easier, but because forgetting leads us back to the edge." In the crowd, no one moved. The silence was full of meaning. just like it had been that night, in the Oval Office, with the photo and the pen. Outside, the world turned as it always had. Trains ran on time, school bells rang, markets opened and closed. The machinery of life moved forward, unaware that history had taken a detour in silence. Inside the White House, the photo remained, not in a gallery, not in a press release, but in a quiet drawer of the general's office. Framed, respected, remembered. It had become something sacred, not because of what it showed, but because of what it stopped. No statues would be built for that moment, no monuments etched with dates, but sometimes the absence of fire is the greatest mark left behind. The Iranian officer in the photo, he had likely passed away years ago, his name lost to time, his story unrecorded. But his smile, captured beside a young American soldier, became a ghost that touched a president's hand. A whisper that said, "Not now, not like this." The general, older now, often walked the White House grounds in the early morning. In the hush before sunrise, he'd think about how many lives had unknowingly crossed the threshold of survival that night. He thought of his father, he thought of the photo, and he thought of a sentence he'd once heard long ago. Peace isn't the absence of war, it's the presence of memory. In the end, the world didn't explode. The countdown clock stopped, and no one, not even history, screamed in triumph. But somewhere in Tehran, a child woke to birdsong instead of sirens, and that was enough.